Sean Healy, Michelle Murphy and Bridget Reynolds are all with Social Justice Ireland. Social Justice Ireland seeks to influence the direction of society generally and on specific topics by providing detailed, rigorous social analysis of a wide range of issues, articulating a desirable vision for the future, and identifying viable, desirable pathways that would lead towards such a future.
Our challenge to the current analysis is that we're actually on a road to nowhere. What you have are economic and social policies which are being implemented on the basis of assertion rather than evidence. So, to give an example of this, in January last 2012, so almost 2 years ago now, Chancellor Angela Merkel argued that austerity was necessary because in the years leading up to the crisis, there were a number of member states who were guilty of budgetary negligence and accumulating extreme amounts of debt. So this assertion was not challenged in the mainstream media, and it is this assertion that it was budgetary negligence of member states that caused the crisis that is underpinning the policies we're now following in the European Union and in Ireland, and policies which will not get us out of the situation that we're in. So if we look at the evidence as to whether there was budgetary negligence leading up to between the years 2000 to 2008, what do we see? You have a graph here showing Germany, Spain and Ireland and their gross consolidated debt as a percentage of GDP between 1999 and 2007. And in that period, all the member states of the European Union were bound by the Stability and Growth Pact. So they had to keep to a threshold of a budget deficit of 3% of GDP or less. Now, in that entire period, the budget deficits of the 27 member states was 0.9% of GDP. Ireland ran a budget surplus every year in that period except 2002 when it had a budget deficit of 0.4% of GDP. And Spain ran budget surpluses in 2005, 2006 and 2007. So the evidence shows that there wasn't budgetary indiscipline and the accumulation of extreme debt across the European Union. Now, Greece is an exception to this, but if you look at the European Union member states as a whole, the evidence points to the budgetary indiscipline of the financial sector, and in particular private lending institutions that were at the heart of the crisis. And some of these private lending institutions were in countries which are at the core of the European Union, and they played a huge part in the crisis which started in 2008. So if we take on board the evidence, and we see that it was the financial industry, how it was regulated, how it was framed, and how it actually worked in the real economy as the cause of the crisis, then the response that we should have had would have been regulation of the financial institutions and the financial sector at a European level, the introduction of a financial transactions tax, which Brigitte mentioned earlier, the elimination of tax havens, which is a hot topic at the moment, and the tackling of financial fraud, tax evasion and aggressive tax planning, and the separation of commercial and investment banking. So that should have been the response to the crisis. However, what we have across Europe and in Ireland is the misinformed opinion and the inaccurate analysis that the crisis of 2008 was caused by a catastrophic profligate drift in public finances and budgetary indiscipline and the accumulation of extreme debt by member states. So instead, as a response, and in an appropriate response to the crisis, we've had the imposition of austerity measures, mainly through reductions in social expenditure and social services across the European Union, and particularly in vulnerable member states who are in programme countries. The financial sector itself has been repaid. Banking debt has been transferred to the state and to the citizen. The ordinary citizen is now repaying this debt because it has become sovereign debt. You have increasing supervision of public finances at a European level, and there are now sanctions for missing fiscal targets for countries who miss their targets in terms of reducing borrowing or their government debt. The fiscal compact has been introduced in the European Union, and this fiscal compact introduces extremely restrictive thresholds for countries in terms of increasing expenditure and investing. And we still have the ongoing dominance of the financial sector. What you hear now are a lot of policies being implemented, and the justification given is that you need this policy in order to reassure the markets. But that's not an appropriate response to the situation that we find ourselves in. And actually, on the next slide now, you see the results of this inappropriate response in Ireland. We have structural unemployment. In particular, we have structural long-term unemployment, which is going to be a huge problem for us in the future. We have rising inequality and poverty levels. We have a sustained child poverty problem. We have an ongoing adult literacy challenge. We have very high net emigration, and what we have is high net emigration of some of the brightest people this country has ever produced. We've lengthening social housing waiting lists, a declining social infrastructure and declining social services. So in reality, we're on a road to nowhere. We've been following an inappropriate response, and it's not just Ireland, this has been across the European Union. In the period 2010 to 2012, over 700 billion euro has been cut from public spending, public employment and investment in 15 European member states. But we are not seeing the increased employment, the growth levels, our movement out of the crisis that we were all promised when we started following the austerity agenda. Instead, what you have across Europe and in Ireland, there are two issues that are being ignored, which is the social dimension and governance. So in terms of the social dimension, we have a failure of leadership at a European level to support those countries that are in crisis. So the financial sector has been protected and supported, and you have seen cuts across the union in terms of healthcare, social protection, pensions, unemployment is rising, but there is no leadership to support those countries that are in difficulty. And what you also have is the imposition of rules now governing budget debt, government debt and government borrowing, which are extremely restrictive. And in reality, in order to get out of the situation we're in, those countries in crisis need to be able to invest and to increase expenditure in order to create high levels of employment and move back to some form of fiscal solvency. But because of the rules that we have now put into our own national constitution of the fiscal compact, we won't be able to do this. We also have a lack of commitment to redistribution, to fair taxation, to solidarity and to the elimination of poverty. Yes, we have stated commitments to these within the European Union, but in reality, in terms of our actions, we're not paying any commitment to these issues. We do have written commitments to them within the Europe 2020 strategy, but the reality is that those countries who are in programs, Troika programs, they're not required to meet the Europe 2020 strategy targets. They're required to meet their programme targets. And other member states which aren't in programmes, they're further away now from their Europe 2020 targets than they were 3 years ago when these targets were set. And although it is acknowledged by everyone in the European Union that the social dimension is crucial to the future of the European Union, the reality is that social policy has now, across Europe, has now become a tool to serve the economy and economic policy. And this is a worrying development, as Sean mentioned earlier. The social dimension is going to be the huge issue going forward for Europe and how it finds legitimacy amongst its citizens. Now, in terms of governance, there is a democratic deficit in the EU, but the crisis itself has exposed how big this deficit is. We poured huge amounts of money into saving the euro, but there was little or no public discussion about the decisions that were made. There was no democratic scrutiny of the European stability mechanism or of how reform programmes were imposed on particular countries. So citizens have not had a say in the policies that are being implemented that impact on them directly. What we also have is the risk of a two-speed Europe emerging. So on one hand, you have countries which will have complete control over their national budgets and which will be at the core of the decision-making process. But on the other hand, you will have countries whose budgets, whose national budgets, will be dictated by European institutions and who will be on the periphery of a decision-making process. We also have a situation where measures designed to meet an emergency situation are now becoming permanent, such as the fiscal compact. And these measures are going to be counterproductive because they will not allow the expenditure and investment needed in order for countries in crisis to get out of the situation that they are presently in. What we actually need is a new policy framework. So I'm going to hand over to Sean now, who will outline our policy framework that we would propose for Ireland.
microphone. How are you?
We think there are two core issues that need to be addressed, that Ireland needs a guiding vision, because if we don't know where we're going, we're not likely to get there, are we? So we need to have some kind of clarity, and we need more than a vision to make Ireland the best small country in the world and wish to do business. With due respect, that's not much of a vision to put before the Irish people and ask for a lot of sacrifice to achieve it. We need something much more than that. So we need some kind of idea of where we're going, and we also need a policy framework to get us there that would sort of handle that stuff. So let's take a look at each of these. The guiding vision. I think it's important to recognise that the economic crisis in Ireland is partly the result of a failure of an economic and social philosophy that elevated private greed over the public good, one that created a false national pride which measured the country's success by the accumulation of individual wealth. And for a while we were going in that direction. But Ireland should be guided by a vision, we would argue, of a just society, a society that respects human rights, protects human dignity, facilitates human development, and preserves the environment. Core values in that type of society would be things like the inviolability of human dignity. That would be the core priority. Equality would be at its core. Human rights, solidarity, sustainability, critical issue that gets missed a lot of the time, and pursuit of the common good. Sometimes gets dismissed, and yet it's critically important if we're to sort of get agreement on where we want to go. The common good must form part of the core of what we're on about. So what type of policy framework do we need? Now, I'd be pretty sure you're not able to read all of that, but it's on page 128 of the book. So that's one of the values of having the book in your hand. What we're basically saying is that Ireland needs a policy framework that integrates 5 key issues, 5 key pillars, if you like, which need to be integrated, and they need to be addressed simultaneously. It is not good enough to say we look after the economy and then when that's fixed, we'll do all the rest. It just doesn't work. That's a very one-dimensional approach that is not going to work in practice. 5 key pillars are required, and these are that we must ensure macroeconomic stability, we must work towards a just taxation system, we must enhance social protection, we must reform governance, and we must put sustainability at the core of all we do. I think these are the things that are required and that Ireland needs if Ireland is to build a future characterised by human dignity and sustainability in an effective and meaningful manner. So let's just take a look at each of these in turn. Ensuring macroeconomic stability. In the Irish context, the first thing we would say is we need debt sustainability, and we are very convinced that the current level of debt, our debt GDP ratio, is simply not sustainable and will not be resolved unless we get a break on the debt. There is an issue here about promises that were made being honoured and so on. But if Ireland doesn't get a break on the debt, we're not getting out of this situation that we're currently in. That's our position, very strongly so. We also believe that there's a need for fiscal stability and for economic growth. We take this as given. We also would argue for the need for investment, very substantial investment. A question was asked earlier on in our opening session about the importance of investment and where was the investment coming from. The answer, I think most people would agree, didn't actually provide any kind of answer. It didn't show where the investment is coming from. For us, there is investment going on in Ireland, but it's not nearly at the scale required. Ireland has the lowest level of investment of any country in the European Union ever recorded by Eurostat since it started counting these numbers more than 20 years, or almost 20 years ago, 1995. No country has had the low level of investment that Ireland currently has on an annual basis. And not alone that, but if Ireland were to increase its investment by 25%, it would still be the lowest level of investment of any country in the European Union. Without investment, there won't be jobs. Without jobs, there won't be recovery. Without recovery, we're stuck in austerity. Investment is critical. We need a step change in the level and scale of investment if we're to move this forward, if we're to have macroeconomic stability. The second area is to move towards a just taxation system. What we would argue is that Ireland should bring its total taxation, not its income tax system only, but its total tax take, by which we mean all taxes of all kinds, national and local charges, everything combined, to bring it closer to the European average, bring it towards. We're quite a distance away, even when measured in this new measure that has been developed by the Fiscal Advisory Council in between GNP and GDP. Even when you take that into account, we're still way below the European average. We need to move in that direction. We need to do this in an equitable way, and we need to reduce income inequality. And taxation has a major role to play in that. We need to enhance social protection. Particularly in this context, I think we need to protect services and the social infrastructure. The infrastructure that supports our social services is being eroded, very seriously damaged. Currently, we would argue close to being undermined. And when it's undermined, it takes an awful lot more to put it back into position than we think, maybe. That's certainly far more than we think we'll save by letting it go. Jerry Mangan asked a question this morning, or made a comment about pensions in the context of comments that had been made earlier. And I just want to put this two numbers before you that are interesting, I think, in this context, and that change perspectives once we put them into place, or once we kind of become aware of them. The average age that people will live is very fast approaching 100. So that people's average lifespan will be 100 years, average. It's also, and these are the studies that are done now on aging and that, there is widespread agreement on the academic side and the research side that the first person to live to be 150 is already born. Now, let's put that into some kind of picture where we're talking about maybe moving the retirement age to 68. Maybe we move it to 70 so somebody can retire at 70 and live another 80 years in retirement. It does change the ballgame. Now, the point at issue here is that we need to start thinking in terms of protecting our social infrastructure, because the kind of codology that goes on, and the kind of, even some of it I noticed this morning, like scaring people about the scale of pensions, is missing what's actually happening. The thing is changing, our demographics are changing far more fundamentally than anything that's being talked about in that context. The second thing we need to do here, obviously, is combat unemployment. I don't think they're going to get any objection here on that, and it was obviously highlighted clearly earlier on today. And poverty reduction. Yes, I would say it is true to say that poverty was falling quite substantially until the start of the crisis. It fell after the start of the crisis too, because there was a momentum to it that kept going for a little while, but then it's in reverse now, and poverty is rising again. 1 in 6 people in Ireland are living in poverty, 1 in 5 children live in poverty, and that's despite the fact that the poverty line has been falling. The numbers below it have been rising. That says something about a lot of things as well. The fourth area that we need to look at is the reforming of governance. Talked about this earlier on. Michelle made some comments about it. We think there are 3 elements we want to highlight out here. One is the need for a reform of policy evaluation. We need to evaluate policy, and we need to evaluate it as we go. And we need to be unafraid of the results. One of the things I admire about the IMF, for example, is the fact that they have conducted a very extensive review of how they missed the crisis of 2007-8 before it, because they didn't see it coming. And I think that's a very positive, powerful development. Istvan this morning was asked a different question about predictions and so on, and his response was that, like, they're always in this space of recognizing that that's an issue that needs to be addressed. And I think that's very important. Policy evaluation is critical. We need a rights-based approach, looking at social, economic and cultural rights, and not just political rights as well. And we need deliberative democracy, by which I do not mean participative democracy. We need much more than that. Deliberative democracy is a process of people engaging in decision-making where the power differentials are left outside the door and the discussions are on the basis of the evidence available. Now that might seem to some people to be a big ask, and yet it seems to me to be a sort of a very simple fundamental, that we should be able to make decisions on the basis of the evidence and not on the basis of the power of a particular group or individual making particular cases. That's the kind of democracy that we need, deliberative democracy. If we're to get people to engage, if we're to get people to take responsibility for the decisions that are made. Fifthly and finally, the fifth pillar is creating a sustainable Ireland. There's a lot of things we could put in here. Combating climate change and protecting the environment are critical. The biggest single game changer on the planet is climate change, and it still seems not to have impacted sufficiently on many people. It's not impacting at all on a lot of other people, and I think it's going to be the key kind of issue of driving change in the years ahead, and we should be dealing with that. Protecting the environment generally is a critical issue. We need balanced regional development. I'm not going to raise this issue. Petra Harder will be dealing with this in the next session when she talks about the challenges facing regions. But we did have a potential of doing something about regional balances and development and so on. I think we blew it, and we're certainly in serious trouble now. The other issue that should be jumping out at us is that we need new indicators for sustainability and well-being to get beyond GDP and so on. These are nowhere near the kinds of things that we want to measure. We should be having a capacity to measure well-being and human flourishing and all of those kinds of things that help to give you then the measurements that keep focus across all 5 pillars of policy and not allowing focus to zoom in only on 1 or 2 dimensions and saying we'll do that and all the rest will follow. That is not a viable way to go. So, bringing this to a conclusion, I think it's critically important as we come to the end of the bailout period and we face this new reality, that we actually take time to reflect, that we take time as a nation to reflect. I think the future requires the recognition and vindication of social, economic and cultural rights. It requires taxation and distribution of resources in society to be looked at, and we need to think in terms of what type of changes and type of future we want in that. We want to think in terms of deliberative democracy and how we can move in that direction. We need to put evidence-based policy into place. I sometimes shudder at what I see happening at the moment, which seems to be policy-based evidence seeking rather than evidence-based policy making. We seem to have the policy and let's go find the evidence to support it. And the results are pretty predictable, and we're seeing them before us. There's also an issue about transparency and accountability that I think all arms of society and the political, economic, cultural structures all need to be accountable to the public in the terms of their analysis and in terms of their actions. And above all, I think at this moment, as we look to the future, as we take the time to reflect on the kinds of things that we need to do or the kinds of shape the future might have, let us remember that to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing.